Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being on our program. I'm Armando F. Sanchez, your host, and I have the honor of interviewing two authors who wrote a book together. It's called Sons of Suicide, a memoir of friendship. Richard Knapp and David Pincus. I have the honor of having the book, having read it. It's about healing. It's about healing. It's about the problems of healing through the issue of unfortunate circumstance of parents committing suicide. Both these gentlemen, Richard and David, experienced that problem each in their own lives. And in time, they came together. They shared friendship. They talked, supported each other, found ways of healing with each other. But they took it to the next level, and that's the level we're at today, is that they took their conversation, their knowledge, their experiences, and they wrote it into a book and shared it with the world so that we can listen in, we can learn the process of the pain, and then move into healing and hope. And that's what I get out of this book. But, enough of me. Let's talk to the authors. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Armando.
Good morning, Armando.
We'll begin the question in the book, Sons of Suicide, written in 2019. What motivated you gentlemen to write this book?
Well, initially, I think it was that we wanted to share our story, our experience, both the tragedy of our mother's suicides and the great healing power of our friendship. We wanted to share that with family and close friends. We hadn't talked about it much. Certainly our wives knew about it and our kids knew something about it, but we wanted to share that. But as we were writing the book and as our wives read an early draft, they observed that the story that we were sharing could be really helpful to others who were in similar circumstances. So we decided to go ahead and go public and actually publish the book, and then embarked on some interviews and speaking engagements and a TEDx talk and an interview like this one. So thank you very much for that.
The fact that we had been silent about our mother's suicides most of our lives, except with each other, finally reached a point where we thought we were feeling comfortable enough to begin to share it more widely, because on one hand, we saw the suicide going through the roof, everyone being affected by suicide, and it talked about in public in ways that was not the case at all when we were 13 and 14 and our mothers took their lives. And we spent 7 years working on the book, knowing in our minds that when we finished, we were going to be obligated to speak out about it. But of course, when that time came, we were shaking in our boots because it was so unlike the rest of our lives. And we can both remember quite vividly our first public appearance after the book was published came at the annual conference of the American Association of Suicidology in Denver. And when we were getting ready to come out before a group of largely researchers and therapists that dealt with suicide as their primary subject, I think both our shirts were drenched. We were really so nervous about it. And we made a split decision, turned out to be a good one, to admit to our audience that this was our first time and we were as nervous as can be. And to our surprise and delight, they all applauded and helped us to relax a little bit. And we were able to move on. And as a result, I guess we became a little bit of a novelty at the conference, and more people sought us out. And we had a chance to really start to feel a little bit more comfortable in talking in ways we never had before.
As I went through this wonderful book, I realized that this is not a clinical book. This is not, wasn't meant to be, something that use it as part of a psychological research or analysis for academia or for the profession. In other words, this is not where you're saying how to. This is truly a story of your emotions, your reactions of grief, and trying to put your worlds together, as it's been unscrambled by the experience of the suicide in your family. And I'm very touched by the stories. You take us through different parts of the world as you're moving along, and you're talking about your feelings. And males, I'm reminded a lot by different people, males are not typically ones that are open to sharing.
We've heard that a lot. And we're not clinicians, and we purposely did not try to give any advice in the book, but rather to share our own experience and the lessons that we learned as a result. I will say that we've had clinicians now talk to us about our book and have wanted to share it with their colleagues so that they can learn from our experience as well. And we've actually been invited now, it won't happen until the 1st of October, but to be featured on the grand rounds of University Hospitals of Cleveland, where I live, with our story for all of the psychologists and psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses and so on, their staff, to share the story. So we're quite heartened by that. To the extent it can help people, even though we're not clinicians, we're really pleased to be able to do that.
Well, it didn't start that way, Armando. Rick lives in Cleveland. I live in Oceanside, California. Just so happened when we finished our manuscript, I was in Cleveland. Karen and I, my wife Karen and I, were visiting Rick and Ellen, and they have always been our best critics and our best cheerleaders as well. And we had asked both of them to read the final manuscript, and then we were all going to sit in Rick's living room and hear what they had to say. And one of the first things they said to us, because our original plan was to share the book merely with family and close friends. It was something we felt they didn't really know about us the way we wanted them to know. But Karen and Ellen, together and independently, said to us, you have to share this more widely because more people need to hear it, especially men who don't tend to open up this way. And Rick and I looked at each other like they were from another planet. That had never occurred to us that we would do that, or that we were unique as men in talking about this the way we did. And long story short, we believed our wives, but we needed to get more proof that it would be worth our taking this leap. And so we found a number of independent readers through friends or colleagues who didn't know us and asked them to read it. Most of them were already suicide survivors, so they were familiar with the subject matter. And it was very clear after a couple of months of doing that, that there was a good basis for us to take this out and talk more broadly about it and focus particularly on men who we did learn are, as we had been, very, very reluctant to talk about their innermost feelings, especially when it came to suicide.
Doing my research on my end, I came across some information, I believe it was a Harvard research, that about approximately 100 people commit suicide per day. And I don't know if the pandemic may have changed those numbers, but I hope not. But by the same token, in that sphere, uh, it's impacting not only the persons that took their lives, but also the family members and extended family, and it just ripples across the community. So healing is critical. I understand that your work heads in that direction, and that's what I read from it. That men need to share, men need to talk about it, not limited to men, but men need to be part of the dialogue and the category of, because I mean, we have emotions too, like everybody else, even though we don't think of that sometimes. Let me ask this question. Did you feel a great sense of shame and embarrassment to write it and share it with people?
I don't think we felt, David may have a different answer to this. I don't think we felt shame or embarrassment writing the book or sharing it. At the time of our mother's suicides, and of course this was 50 some years ago, there was quite a stigma associated with suicide, and it bled on to suicide survivors. There must be something wrong in that household, or with those, maybe those children inherited some gene. Was that something that I imagined as the child of a woman who took her own life? Perhaps. But I think there was some of that in our society, certainly at the time, and even now. There's still stigma around suicide. And writing the book was, in many respects, cathartic for us. It brought back memories. At one point, I called my sister and said, "Do you remember this? Here's how I remember it, but what am I missing?" And she helped fill in some of the blanks. Or David and I would remember things that we did together in the aftermath after we met, which was a couple of years after our mothers had taken their lives, that were particularly helpful to us along the way. So it was somewhat cathartic, but I would not say, and again, David may disagree, but that I felt embarrassed or ashamed as I was writing it. But
I would say pretty much what Rick said, that didn't feel any embarrassment at writing the book or sharing it, but at the time, great embarrassment. It was such a taboo subject in the early '60s when this happened to us, that neither of our fathers, in telling us about our mothers, used the word suicide. It was just not a word that anyone wanted to use. And I don't remember any of my adult family members using it either, even though everyone knew. And I think as young teenagers, we were filled with all sorts of different feelings and emotions, from guilt to the embarrassment to the feeling that we might be carrying a part of the gene that suicide in it. And it's one of those topics, if you bring up with someone or someone brings it up, the conversation never advances very far because folks don't know what to say. And that's one of the reasons I think we were silent most of our lives, because we used to say to each other, it's not a topic that comes up at cocktail parties. Or if it does, once it does, everybody looks at each other not knowing what to say, and it's over.
You're in some kind of an environment, you share that about your book, what the topic is, it's your personal stories. You shared, people don't know how to react. How should they react?
Well, I don't know that there's a should in there. I mean, it's difficult to react to the loss of anybody. I just went to a funeral last weekend, and it's hard to know what to say, no matter what the cause of death was. Certainly say you're sorry to hear it, you're sorry for the loss. Maybe you'd ask, are you okay? Which I think is very important with survivors of suicide loss. But I don't know that there's a should. It's interesting because you mentioned, Armando, that there are many people affected by each suicide, and actually at the University of Kentucky, they did some research that revealed that for every suicide, there are about 135 people on average who are affected in some way. Their immediate family, obviously, children like we were at the time, but extended family, as you pointed out, co-workers, the person in the grocery store who you'd see every week, who knew the person who took his or her own life, and it just balloons from there. Mm-hmm. So it is something that many of us share, an experience that many of us share, but don't talk about. David said, it's not something you talk about at a cocktail party. I'll tell a little story here. David,
it's a very astute question, I think. Some of the people closest to us we've talked to about this a little bit, so we get a little sense of how others perceive it. And the knee-jerk reaction apparently is, if someone hears there's a suicide, they want to know what was the method. And then secondly, the question we never are able to really answer is why. Mm-hmm. And for us, that has been a question we have been asking one another for 60 years. And while I think the process of working on the book and revisiting ourselves years ago and discussing some of the issues has helped us get a little better picture of our mothers. And I think we've been able to forgive a bit more through our own understanding, be a little less angry, perhaps. Rick's and my feelings that way are a little different. For me, the question of why will always be. And that may be the hardest thing of all, I think, for us to talk about openly.
What could a person say? Okay, let's say I just met you. I've never known you before. You're somewhere in the conversation you share again about your book, Sons of Suicide, and I say, well, what is this about? You share your personal story. What can I ask that would help me learn more about what you're saying, rather than saying this is not a subject I want to talk about and sort of walk away from you?
Yeah, there are a couple things, Armando, that you might ask. Of course, for us, our mother's deaths are more than 50 years ago. So there's a lot of time has passed. And I would suggest that the question might be answered a little bit differently if it was a relatively new experience rather than something half a century ago. Mm. If someone were to tell me that they had lost someone to suicide, I would first say, I'm really sorry to hear that. That must have been a terrible experience. And how are you doing? Or how did you cope with that? Or how are you coping with that? And encourage the person to talk about in our case, our mothers, rather than about the suicide itself, because our mothers are not defined by their suicide. They were people in their own right. Again, David and I were in somewhat different situations. David's mother had attempted suicide several times before and had been in a psychiatric hospital. My mother, as far as I know, had never attempted suicide before. So we have different environments that we would reflect on. But I think trying to understand a little bit about the person who took their own life and about the relationship is a good way to go, but doing it gently. And some people want to talk about it and some don't, and that's fine too.
That's right. One of the most satisfying comments that we get about the book is the fact that people don't find it to be morbid or a downer, because for us, the story is really about how we kind of saved each other, have helped one another really through life, and that overcoming suicide is very doable. We have, yeah, we've lived a life with uh, a painful suicide, but our lives have not been painful or unhappy. They've been quite happy and content, and we've lived lives I think we always hoped we would live. But we can't get away from our past. And I think by doing the book, it was a way of saying we're no longer trying to. And the fact that Sons of Suicide in this case is us primarily, but it also includes two other friends of ours who also lost a parent to suicide as young adults, one of whom was a close friend to both of us for 20 years before we accidentally discovered that we also shared the same common background, which again brings out the fact how rarely men in particular speak about the suicide.
Yeah, we don't want to exclude the females. I mean, I'm not, we should not, never, but I think it's males put on an extra layer of barriers for themselves sometimes because either society or self-imposed, and that leads to also additional and unique problems. And I think both of you indirectly address that issue through your book. Maybe it was your intent, maybe not, but that's not the critical point, is that you did go ahead and do that. Also, the other point that comes into my mind as I'm listening to you is that we're hearing more and more about cyberbullying, which is leading into suicide. And if we don't talk about that in the present moment, it's just going to get worse. It's not something that's just going to fade away. And especially I run into a great deal of effort and time that people are putting into trying to rescue veterans. And not only in the United States, but worldwide, that veterans are also taking their lives. And this is not to say it's a similar issue, but if we don't talk about it, if we don't address that the issue of suicide is there, but by whatever means, I think we'll perpetuate the problem rather than find hope, which you gentlemen found in each other.
That's
Well,
right.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We met by happenstance on a street corner the senior year of high school. I was standing on the wrong street corner, and David was on the other street corner and called me over. And I think he thought I was a real idiot for not knowing where to stand to catch the bus. But once, within a week or two, we had some discussions that led us to understand that both of our mothers had taken their lives just a few years before. And it was, I think the way we've termed it before is it was like a dam burst. And all of a sudden, all these emotions came out because we could identify with each other. We could listen to each other. We could understand it. There were differences, but there were a lot of similarities. And we would take walks after school. We'd go to, David was living with his aunt and uncle. We'd go to their house for Oreos and cookies and sit and talk for a while. Or we'd go to my house, which is a little bit further away, and talk. Or we'd just walk around a park near us and sit on a park bench. And so what we realized in writing the book was that park benches seemed to come up several times, and that in a sense, the park bench was our psychiatrist's couch, and we were each other's counselors or therapists. There weren't many resources around at the time in the mid 60s to help with victims of or survivors of suicide loss, and particularly children at the time. And even if there were, this goes to your earlier point, Armando, there was it was almost shameful if you had to go to a psychiatrist. It was a sign of weakness.
I remember that.
And my dad fought in World War II, and he was stoic, and he got through that. By God, we can get through anything. You just have to buck up, especially if you were a man. And so that's lessened some over time. but still there. There's still an expectation that men particularly, you're right, women too, but men particularly need to just get through it, just push through it, you'll be okay. Well, it was, thank goodness that we found each other, because I don't know if we would have been okay without the opportunity that the bench and the therapist that David was to me and I was to him, that provided to us.
Yeah, so that's why we call each other doctor now.
That's good.
Well, David has a PhD and I don't. So
He's rubbing it in your faces through friendship.
That's
I get
right.
that part.
That's right.
One thing that makes this book really, really special, I have piles and piles of authors I've interviewed. One of the things that stands out in this particular book is that the net proceeds from this book, Sons of Suicide, will be donated to nonprofit focusing on suicide prevention, survivors, grief counseling, and mental health. I applaud what you're doing, gentlemen. That's really special.
Thank you.
Thank you. We in the fumbling around at the beginning to figure out what we were going to do with the book, that became something of great importance to us, because this was never meant to be a money-making venture, although we wouldn't mind making a little. And the idea then would be that we could give to organizations that we know are doing good work, many of which now we've sort of coming back around to the thrust of what worked for us and what is, we think, the central message of our book is this notion of opening up to someone you trust, as we were able to do with each other, because that seemed to be opening the door to healing in ways we had avoided for several years up to that point. And that's, again, it becomes very hard for a lot of people to do that on a subject like this. And so if you have someone that you're comfortable with, who you know you can trust to hold your confidences, and in our case, one who could speak to those same issues, talking about it, hearing it, being able to discuss it, and have someone tell it back to you makes it real. If it's just kept inside your head, you can avoid it. You can step aside from it. But if you put it out there, then it's part of your reality.
Yeah. And actually just keeping it inside your head works like a pressure cooker does, just building up, and you think about it, and you imagine things that may not be, and you ponder it until, for some people, they actually can't function, and that's too bad. One of the tragic things is that for children and young teens who have lost a parent to suicide, they are 3 times more likely to take their own lives as well. So having outlets, in our case, a good friend, but also there are a lot more therapists out there now, psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors and support groups and organizations that can be helpful is really critical.
I take your point, and we've been talking about suicide across the show, but group therapy for people that are having personal issues in marriage, alcohol, drug abuse, etc., could also benefit from listening to your words, because it's the same process for different reasons to heal, to find hope.
That's right. Well, we've been heartened actually by some of the comments we've gotten from people, not only suicide loss survivors like we are, but others who said, well, I've been lucky. I've never had anybody close to me take their own life, but I had some other tragedy and in my life, and this was very helpful to me. So exactly what you're saying, and boy, that's it's wonderful to hear that what we've written, sharing what we've learned over time and our experience has been helpful to others.
Well, I want to make sure that we've been doing it throughout the show, but I want to emphasize again that you do have a website, sonsofsuicidebook.com. And so I'm glad you're doing that. So what I'm asking now is that the viewers of this program can visit this website and keep up with where you're going to be, speaking engagements, sending you emails, asking questions, and learning more about where to obtain the book, of course.
That's terrific. And on that website are some essays that we've written, one that was published in the San Diego paper, another that was published in Cleveland paper, interview that we did on public radio. Certainly we'll put this interview on the website as well, a TEDx talk that we did. So we hope that those resources will be useful. And some of them take a little bit different tact. Over time, we've talked a lot about our experience, certainly, and what we've learned, but also not just about the suicides and the facts of what happened and the experiences we had, but also about the value of the friendship and the lessons we've learned.
Absolutely. We're getting, unfortunately, getting close to the end of the show. And again, we've been talking to the authors of Richard Knapp and David Pincus on Sons of Suicide, which I found in going into the internet and just printing in the name of the book, and it popped up as well. And again, your website is sonsofsuicidebook.com. And so as we're ready to close the show, I have tons of questions, but I'm trying not to go there because I'm just sort of getting started here. But I wanted to sort of give time to each one of you for your closing statements.
David, you want to go first?
Well, first, I would like to thank you, Armando, for having us and for delving into the subject in the way that you did. It wasn't cursory. I think it really helped us to dig a little deeper as well. And our hope is that if folks are either survivors, as we were, or those facing the possibility of suicide, that they reach for help, reach out to someone close, because that for us made the difference in our lives. And this is something we know. That's what we're trying to share, that this is not something to keep in the shadows, but to bring out into the light.
Right. Thank you, Armando. This has been wonderful. And I'd encourage people to obviously to look at what we've written and to listen to this video, but also to share it with others, because the more people we can reach, the better. There are too many suicides, too many suicides in the United States and around the world. And it's tragic, not only for the person who's taking his or her own life, but for all of those around them. And they're not alone. There are many of us out there. There are a lot of resources available, so they don't have to be alone. And there is life after the loss of someone to suicide or the experience of other kinds of traumatic events. So thank you for sharing the message.
I have both of you to thank for bringing the issue to the surface, putting it in our faces, saying, here we are, we're telling you our life stories, we're opening ourselves up to you, and look at your own lives. And prevention. We don't want to talk about this, already something happened. We want to look into prevention. And that's what I get out of your book. I get the hope, I get the thought process of thinking, okay, what can I do to look at myself or look at others as well? If I look at people, I look at them a little bit more differently. I says, is there something I can help to extend that sense of hope? And I get that information transferred from you through your book to all of us. And I like the term when you said it's worldwide, under any languages, under any customs, under any cultures. Unfortunately, we all suffer from this problem in our society, and we need to bring the numbers down constantly. So thanks for your work, your contribution. I wish you continual success. And I'd like to have you back in the shows to talk more about this, to talk about more in depth about the specific issues that you've run into, and then continue the process of healing. I applaud your work, gentlemen. Continue your ongoing efforts to reach to all of us and give us a warning sign, a foghorn sound that be careful, look for the signs, look more into it, learn about it, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you,
Thank
Rick.
you,
Thank you,
Armando.
David.
Thank you,
Look forward to having you on
Armando.
the show again.
Okay, we look forward to it.
Bye.
Stay safe. We're still in those issues. Stay safe
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
that little virus running
Thank you.
around. Stay
Yeah.
safe.
Have a great time in Cancun.
I'll try. As I was sharing with David, I'm going in the middle of the time when it's the hottest and hurricane season. So what could possibly go wrong with those options?
Fingers crossed, Armando. Fingers crossed.